Hello, I'm Amanda Walker and welcome to Inside America, the show that brings you insight and analysis of the biggest issues facing the United States right now. In today's episode, has ICE gone too far? High-profile, fatal incidents and aggressive tactics have triggered a backlash over the Trump administration's hardline deportation drive. US citizens are mobilizing and pushing back, with direct confrontations on the rise. In response, the Trump administration has made a rare about-face with a partial deployment drawdown. But will it be enough to calm the growing outrage being felt across the country? Coming up, we examine how a culture of fear is making families too scared to leave their homes.
We have babies who are not coming in to get vaccines. It's the height of flu season. We have, parents, pregnant patients who are afraid to come in and get scans to make sure that their babies are doing okay.
And we discuss the controversial rhetoric from the very top following the fatal shootings of Renee Good and Alex Pretty.
But sometimes the rhetoric gets ahead of the facts. And in this case, 30, 45 minutes after this tragic shooting, that's exactly what happened.
Now, Minneapolis is in the eye of the Trump immigration storm after 2 US citizens were killed by federal forces. Their deaths lit a flame, intensifying public outrage, despite efforts from the Trump administration to justify the killings. Let's watch a reminder of where all this started before we discuss where it might lead.
Please, go home! We don't want you here!
Get the Thanks for the support!
President Trump's hardline immigration raids have gone into overdrive. Thousands of ICE and Border Patrol agents have been deployed in Democrat-led cities. On January 7th, that tension reached boiling point when 37-year-old Renee Good, a US citizen, was shot and killed by an ICE agent in Minneapolis. Good was in her car protesting the presence of ICE in her neighborhood. In the immediate aftermath, President Trump was quick to share his version of events, posting on Truth Social and falsely stating that Good had violently, willfully, and viciously ran over the ICE officer who seems to have shot her in self-defense. Minnesota's Democratic leaders strongly pushed back on that claim.
They are already trying to spin this as an action of self-defense. Having seen the video of myself, I want to tell everybody directly, that is bullshit.
Days later, President Trump offered a slight shift in tone.
And, they're going to make mistakes sometimes. ICE is going to be too rough with somebody, or, they're dealing with rough people. They're going to make a mistake sometimes. It can happen. We feel terribly.
Then, another deadly encounter during a Minneapolis protest. On January 24th, federal Border Patrol agents shot and killed Alex Pretty, also 37 and a US citizen. After moving to help another protester who had been pepper sprayed by a federal agent, Pretty was tackled to the ground. Several seconds later, an officer can be heard shouting that he has a gun, which a subsequent government review did not confirm. At least 2 agents then opened fire at close range. Before any investigation, Homeland Security Secretary Kristi Noem moved quickly with her explanation of what happened, an account that soon came under heavy scrutiny.
An individual approached U.S. Border Patrol officers with a 9mm semi-automatic handgun. The officers attempted to disarm this individual, but the armed suspect reacted violently. Fearing for his life and for the lives of his fellow officers around him, an agent fired defensive shots. This looks like a situation where an individual arrived at this scene to inflict maximum damage on individuals and to kill law enforcement. When you perpetuate violence against a government because of ideological reasons and for reasons to resist and perpetuate violence, that is the definition of domestic terrorism.
Important that it no longer recognizes.
As questions mounted, President Trump stepped in, quietly sidelining Nome by replacing the border control commander, shifting reporting directly to himself. Later, he had a 2-hour closed-door meeting with Nome as she started to feel the heat for her agency's response. Her handling of the case sparked rare bipartisan blowback, with 2 high-profile Republican senators publicly calling for her firing.
She clearly doesn't know how to manage. She's never managed a large organization, and she's failing at every possible measure of the job.
I think we would be better served with new leadership of the department.
And other Republicans broke ranks to blast Nome's response to the shootings. Republican Senator Susan Collins said ICE must stop its operations in her state of Maine.
And every senator, Democrat or Republican.
And Senator Ted Cruz used the opportunity to torch the Trump administration's handling of the immigration issue as a whole.
Escalating the rhetoric doesn't help, and it actually loses credibility. And so I would encourage the administration to be more measured, to recognize the tragedy and to say we don't want anyone's lives to be lost. And the politicians who are pouring gasoline onto this fire, they need to stop.
Senator Rand Paul tweeted, "I can't recall ever hearing a police chief immediately describing the victim as a domestic terrorist or a would-be assassin." Richard Stanek is the former sheriff of Hennepin County in Minnesota. He says the investigations into the killings have far exceeded the norms.
You know, I think people rushed to get information out to the public. Being transparent with the public is great, but sometimes the rhetoric gets ahead of the facts. And in this case, 30, 45 minutes after this tragic shooting, that's exactly what happened. And it was unfortunate, but it's hard to take back those words once they're out there.
Protesters would say that this all started because ICE have been behaving in an aggressive, illegal fashion, that they've been arresting people who are innocent, that they have taken over cities and made citizens live in fear, and that it's not acceptable. And obviously this is all backed by President Trump. What's your response to that?
I think you are correct that what people have seen, they can believe. If they believe the tactics have been over the top or aggressive, I think local law enforcement would agree. Local law enforcement wants to work with federal law enforcement. If local law enforcement was working with federal law enforcement, you would not see these over-the-top aggressive tactics as you described. So let local law enforcement work with them. Let them do what they do best. They know their communities. They know their residents. They spent years and years and years trying to build trust in the community. What I saw through some of the protests was rocks were being thrown at Minneapolis police just as hard as they were being thrown at federal law enforcement officers from ICE. That is a problem. The protesters themselves don't know the difference or don't want to know the difference or don't want to distinguish the difference. So I'm not sure how it helps not having local law enforcement work with federal law enforcement. I think that is a huge problem, and that's really what we see as sheriffs across this country and police chiefs as part of the problem. We want to work together, not separate.
And what happens when you have this huge mistrust in all agencies?
I think, this is problematic because we go all the way back to, September 11th of 2001. And we said, look, there was a massive breakdown in communications and intelligence, and we didn't work together, and people had their own silos they operated under. And so for the last 25 years, we tried to break down those silos. We think we've done a pretty good job. And now here we are today in Minneapolis, Minnesota, and those silos are just as strong as ever. Local law enforcement not working with federal law enforcement, politicals arguing with each other, and the people who lose out at the end of the day are the residents of Minnesota, the residents of Minneapolis. My family, my friends, my neighbors, it cuts right to the core, honestly.
At the heart of these conflicting narratives over this devastating violence are communities living in fear. Troubling stories keep emerging. Images of this 5-year-old boy detained by ICE caused a national outcry. After being flown to a detention centre, a judge has since ordered he be returned home. And this man, an innocent, legal immigrant, offered no dignity.
Chong Li Tao was, we all saw the images of him being dragged out in his underwear from his house, a legal, U.S. citizen who had done nothing wrong. And, her fears were borne out. And I think our patients they're terrified. They are really worried to come in.
Whitney Kinsey works at a Minneapolis community health clinic used primarily by immigrant families.
So my personal patient population is about 50% Latino. And so, yes, there has been a huge decrease in the amount of people who are seeking care. I would say my patient census among my Latino patients went down to about 25% of what it was before ICE came. It is really stunning. There was a day I saw 6 patients. I normally see 22. And that is not attributable, in my opinion, to anything other than people just being scared. We have, heard anecdotes of people who are afraid to come in because ICE is in their parking lot of their apartment building. We had a patient actually taken by ICE on their way to an appointment with us. We have babies who are not coming in to get vaccines. It's the height of flu season. We have, parents, pregnant patients who are afraid to come in and get scans to make sure that their babies are doing okay. We're constantly afraid of even how we document about our patients. What do we put in the chart? What do we not? How do we protect people's privacy? How do we speak to them about how to stay safe? And safety at this point looks like, how do you have a plan for your children if you are taken by ICE? How do you, what legal rights do you have, to maintain your safety? These are conversations that I, as a healthcare provider, am having with patients, and that has nothing to do with their physical health. They're there to talk about their blood pressure or their diabetes, but I'm now having to have discussions with many of my patients about these legal issues that are so outside of the scope of what I would normally be dealing with as a healthcare provider.
Whitney lives just blocks away from where Renee Good and Alex Pretty were killed. The community is pulling together in the face of what's widely seen as an occupation.
And so one of the things that I have been so impressed by is the random 70-year-old grandma who is, out delivering groceries to a family in her neighborhood. Or, one of my friends literally sits on a street corner every day. She takes her laptop out in the corner of her house. It's 20 degrees, has a fire pit there, and she patrols. She sits there and she blows a whistle if she hears ICE in her neighborhood.
That sentiment is being echoed across the country as US cities continue to voice their solidarity with Minneapolis.
Now, the administration has since scaled back their so-called Operation Metro search, cutting the force from 3,000 agents in Minneapolis to about 2,000. But how much difference will that actually make on the ground? And how different are ICE's current tactics to what we've seen before? To get some clarity on this, let's talk to Scott Shukart, a former senior official under the Biden administration. Scott, welcome. I think we spoke 6 months ago, maybe, when we were doing a show about the use of masks by ICE agents. I'm going to quote you, if you don't mind, but at the time then you said, "I worry a great deal about how things are going to get worse, and I also worry that as opposition to this rises, and just the chance of an accident rises, that somebody's going to get hurt. Somebody's going to take a shot at an ICE officer, they're going to return fire, and that's going to be a firefight. I think the chance of that happening is astonishingly high, very dangerous, very unwarranted." If this was so predictable as you predicted, how was it allowed to happen that we reached this point?
Well, unfortunately, I think the administration wanted something like this to happen. They have been trying to escalate the stakes. They have been trying to set themselves in opposition to protest. They've been doing a number of things to surveil protesters, to try to crack down on protest. They have wanted conflict, and maybe staring into the abyss of 2 U.S. citizens being killed by security forces, they've backed down a little bit from that, having gotten what they wanted.
Let's go back a little bit. Deportations are not new. President Obama was nicknamed the deporter-in-chief because of the record numbers of deportations during his tenure. What's different now?
Well, in all prior administrations, there's been some kind of prioritization. It's not as though we don't have a problem with people out of status in the United States. It's well over 10 million people who are in some way out of status, who maybe some of them could regularize status, some of them really have no legal way to regularize status. And it's been a priority of Democratic and Republican administrations to put people through the process, and at the back end of the process, if there's no legal way for them to stay here, to deport them, and to make sure that we aren't creating incentives for people to come illegally expecting that they can stay for a long period of time. But every other administration had priorities: to go after serious criminals first, to go after recent border crossers second, to go after people who are at least accused of serious crimes, multiple drug driving offenses, things like that. What's different about this administration is that instead of, at least until last week, instead of prioritizing people who there's really good reason not to want in this country because we just don't have the bandwidth to deport 10 million people tomorrow, they are just going for numbers. There are arrest quotas, maybe 3,000 a day, we've heard the White House once, and they're just trying to optimize for throughput. They're trying to get their hands on people who are easy to get their hands on rather than prioritizing serious criminals and so forth.
It's an incendiary situation that we're seeing on the ground, particularly in Minneapolis. We spoke to Sheriff Richard Stanek earlier in the show, and his explanation for that was that there's a lack of cooperation between ICE agents and local police. Is that what you see as the problem here? Is this why things are so inflamed?
I don't think that is the problem, but I do think that that is a problem. Traditionally, law enforcement does communicate and does work well together, but at least going back to the deployment in Chicago, we have seen ICE not communicating or miscommunicating with local officials and local police. Police in Chicago got tear gassed by ICE because they didn't know what the operation was. And so without deconfliction, federal immigration authorities are not local police. They have different authorities. They aren't supposed to be doing traffic control. They aren't supposed to be doing crowd control. That should be allocated between the different departments doing their different functions. And ICE is instead, not just ICE, but ICE and CBP are kind of trying to own the whole, the whole battle domain, trying to do everything themselves. And that's dangerous. They're not trained for it. They're not equipped for it. They don't have the numbers for it. They don't have the community trust for it. And long term, you have to get that collaboration with local police.
So what would you say is causing or making this so explosive in terms of what's the most egregious thing that sticks out for you in the way all of this is being conducted?
Well, I really have to say there are two things. One is doing mass street arrests of people who look like they might be foreign. It's really very un-American to do that kind of profiling at scale, the way ICE and CBP are doing, and which unfortunately the way the Supreme Court has blessed it. And the way they are treating legal protest, people who are just filming police activity on their iPhones as though that is somehow illegal. The way they have been saying that protesters deserve what they get if they get hurt or killed for exercising their lawful right to protest, to record, to speak their mind. Those are both just really egregious violations of what the federal government's role should be in enforcing the law and in respecting dissent.
And what about generally the way this is being approached? And I'm speaking about the two fatal killings of Renee Good and Alex Pretty. Information wars, rushes to judgment. On the one hand, Alex Pretty is a domestic terrorist. On the other hand, he's a public hero. How can you ever cut through to the facts, which is a perennial problem in the age we're in at the moment, but without buy-in from the federal government on these issues? Can the facts ever really be delivered in an objective, neutral, honest way?
Well, they could be if the President and the Secretary of Homeland Security weren't pathological liars. They are committed to just saying what is in their interest rather than what has any bearing on the truth. And when they get caught, when there are 4 iPhone videos of something that they've been lying about, maybe they backpedal. But there has to be some sort of commitment to a shared human truth environment, and they don't seem to have that commitment at all.
Could there be a consequence of it, though, that immediate rush to judgment, protection essentially for agents? Is that going to embolden those agents to have a kind of reduced fear of any kind of consequences in what they're doing on the ground?
Yeah, I mean, it all seems to be downstream of the president having pardoned the people who tried to have a coup, on his behalf on January 6th, 2021. People feel like if they take wrongful action in service of this president, that he will look out for them. And so, yes, there has to be clarity that there's going to be accountability. The good news is in the United States, we have a federal structure. The states are not subservient to the federal government. State prosecutors are able to go after even federal agents who commit crimes.
Let's talk about that, because President Trump has said that federal officers have absolute immunity when it comes to state or local prosecution.
Yeah, he's wrong. I mean, Stephen Miller said that. The vice president has said that. They're wrong. That is just not the law and never has been.
And is there anything inside the current culture where this public backlash could be seen as kind of proof that they're doing what the Trump administration wants them to do?
I think that's a really valid concern. I hope not.
What would you say to an ICE agent today who was having concerns about all of this? Speak up? Leave? Carry on doing what you're doing? I mean, it's a very difficult position if you're an ICE agent who doesn't want, we're assuming they all want to do things the way they're being done. What if you don't?
I think there is scope for people to act professionally and to insist on professionalism, to do the parts of the job that they're being allowed to do correctly, and to make sure, if they're a supervisor, that the people under them are being instructed correctly. It's not as though the work that ICE is doing doesn't have anything important to it, and particularly the part of ICE that deals with serious crimes, child sexual abuse, cross-border financial transactions. That's very important stuff, and we wouldn't want everybody to quit overnight in a huff, but it needs to be done professionally.
What would you change about the way they're operating internally right now? If you could go in and give a speech to these agents, what would you say?
Yeah, well, it's important to follow the law. It's important to go after targets where they have done reasonable diligence, that it is going to promote public safety to do those arrests. And then it's important downstream, we haven't talked about it as much, that if people are detained, that they're detained humanely. There are terrible stories of measles outbreaks and other things coming out of ICE detention. ICE has doubled its detention space this year, shoveling as much money as possible to private prison companies that don't seem to be running safe or humane detention centers. And so all the way down the line, they need to be doing arrests, they need to be operating detention, they need to be performing removals in ways that comply with the law, and that means complying with basic human rights.
Complying with the law brings in the issue of administrative warrants, something you don't agree with. Just remind us what those are. Essentially, it's about giving agents broader powers to arrest people. Why do you disagree with those?
Well, to be clear, arresting someone in the street for a civil immigration infraction under the law only requires an administrative warrant, which is it's a piece of paper that's created by ICE. It's just signed by an ICE supervisor. The question is, what is required to forcibly enter somebody's home or forcibly enter the private part of a workplace, the back office of a restaurant or something like that? Under the U.S. Constitution, under the Fourth Amendment, invasions into private space require a warrant that is signed by an independent officer. That is almost always by somebody who's a judge or works for the judiciary. What ICE is claiming now is that these administrative warrants, something they just print off their computer and have a supervisor sign, allow them to invade private homes so long as the person they are looking for has already been ordered removed through the appropriate process. That's what doesn't make any sense to me. You still need, under the Constitution, an independent, detached official, not the supervisor who's deciding the bonus of the ICE officer who's making the arrest. You need an independent official to say that there is a fair probable cause to invade that person's home and put hands on them. That's what's needed.
What about this notion of ICE building essentially a kind of parallel surveillance system that sidesteps courts entirely?
Yeah, it's really troubling the extent to which ICE at least says that it is recording people's identities. It's been following peaceful protesters back to their homes. They have access to a lot of information on, for example, license plates. You know, any CCTV camera that's recording license plates goes into various databases that ICE might have access to. It's really disturbing.
You gave us a prediction last time, which was very accurate, sadly. In terms of where we are right now. I have to ask you, what next? Where does this go? We've seen a sort of de-escalation attempt in terms of the number of agents from the Trump administration being deployed in Minneapolis. Are we going to see more of that, or is that a token gesture? Where do you see this in 6 months' time?
The thing that I am most worried about right now that I am hearing is that they are going to be going after families with small children more aggressively, and because of the limits on detaining those families, that they're going to try to ship them across the border to Mexico and detain them there. I am very worried about real harm coming to children as a part of this administration's efforts, and I hope that there's some way to make sure that's done humanely.
As we saw with the 5-year-old boy who was detained, that created an outcry because the optics of that, this tiny boy with an agent's hand on his little backpack, you know, if there's more of that, do they care, the administration, about these optics and people essentially becoming more and more outraged by what they're seeing? Or does that not really matter?
I mean, I can't peer inside their heads. These are the same people who deliberately separated children from their families in 2018, thinking that that was a good way to deter border crossings. So far as I can tell, they are chiefly interested in appealing to their core supporters. They don't seem to care very much that the majority of the country is against them.
Should we talk again in 6 months?
Sure, I'd love to.
Let's do it. Scott Shukart, thank you so much for your time. So that's it for this week's show. Thank you for watching. Do join us again next time on Inside America.